The name of my talk is A Blueprint for Intuitive Internal Elixir Ecosystems. It's a little bit of a tongue twister, not quite as bad as Jose's at the beginning of the day during the keynote. So yeah, by way of introduction, my name is Ryan Young. I'm the Director of Engineering at theScore, like you mentioned. Over the course of my career, I've spent a long time at Etsy, a short time at WeWork, and for the last few years, I've been at Spotify. And I recently joined theScore in February, and it's just been great so far. It's one of the few places that actually kind of like lets me work on my two favorite things, sports and Elixir. That's a photo of me running, which is my favorite sport. And you can't see, but I am thinking about Elixir in that photo. And of course, if you find anything interesting about the talk or relevant, get in touch after. We're absolutely hiring. So, a few years ago, I joined Spotify. And Spotify is a huge engineering organization. Like hundreds of engineers, thousands of microservices, like huge in every sense of the world, in every sense of the word. And like most big organizations, there's just a lot going on. So with thousands of microservices out there, figuring out what service is responsible for what, who owns that service, what the API it exposes is, how to interact with it, what its performance looks like, what its SLAs are, like all of that information is really important. And it's really difficult, like if you don't know where to go to find that out, just as an engineer trying to get your work done. So that's what Backstage does. Backstage is the tool that Spotify created to kind of like tackle that problem. It's since been open sourced. You can find it at backstage.io if you're curious. I highly recommend it. So its main point is to kind of like catalog and bring order to all of these microservices so that you can find them, browse them, search them, find information about them all in one spot, which is super necessary. But as it pertains to this talk, the key thing that it let you do was it was your one-stop shop for creating a new service or any type of project, really. So this is a screen grab from their site, and this is kind of like how that UI behaved. You could basically like spin up a new service with just the click of a button, right? And you say, I want a new service, click it, and it'll drop you into kind of like a wizard where you answer a couple like form-based questions, and out the other end, it'll spit a fully baked code base for you, right? And that's pretty great, but that in and of itself, not so impressive. Like we've seen that before, pretty much like every framework, every tech stack has that. But what was truly magical about that is that your project already, without you having to do anything, had the right configuration baked right into it, right from the get-go, guaranteed to be up to date and correct. And this is hugely important at a large organization like Spotify, where you've got a bunch of different tools that each service needs to plug into. It needs to be configured in just the right way so that it can run on the infrastructure. It handles like how it gets deployed, where to go to find your secrets, what metrics to display on the Grafana dashboard, who's on the PagerDuty rotation, what team owns it, what's their Slack information so I can get a hold of them. Like all of that needs to be in every single repo, just so it can be standardized, right? And you can search it and find it and on and on. So contrast that, like this beautiful like click the button and I'm done experience, contrast that with Elixir at Spotify. So you need to understand Elixir at Spotify is kind of like a fringe experimental language internally. It's very much like off the beaten path, off the golden path, as we would call it. You can spin up an Elixir project easily enough, right? We all know like mix, new, whatever, and there you go. But beyond that, I had to come up with all the right incantations for the config files on my own through trial and error. You'd have to kind of like read some arcane like wiki page that somebody a few years ago who had been like poking around and experimenting with, and it's out of date, and you copy and paste some things from other repositories that may be doing the same or similar type thing to what you think you might want to accomplish. So a little bit of the pain whenever we were kind of like first starting out with it and just kind of like trying to play around and get something up and running on production on Spotify infrastructure. And this is one of the key points I want to make over the course of my talk. For all of the conversations that we have as a community about like increasing Elixir adoption at various companies, this to me is the main hurdle. You have to make it as easy as possible to go from 0 to production ready, or at the very least, you have to meet or exceed like the status quo of your other internal options. So for the rest of the talk, I'll focus on how I set about trying to accomplish just that. So if we're talking about one-click installs, or starting from a single command, Elixir already has us covered, right? We can just run mix new foo to generate a skeleton project, and that works really well, right? But I still want all of my custom internal configuration boilerplate already included, and this doesn't give that to you, obviously. I effectively want not just mix new foo, I want mix Spotify.new foo. Or for the rest of this talk, I'll use Spotify and Acme interchangeably, so you see that in some of the code snippets, just as a generic placeholder for your company. So I want to run mix acme.new and have that handle everything for me. So if you're familiar with the Phoenix framework, as I'm sure a lot of you all are, you might know that you can run mix phoenix.new. And that will build on top of the basic project skeleton and add in some of its own files. It's also a command that you can run anywhere, since it's actually an archive that you need to install. So mix phoenix.new uses the mix generator module under the hood. This side note, mix generator is full of great goodies. And that's kind of like how you can copy files over or manipulate your code base programmatically. So it lets you define and then render templates, just like if you were rendering like a hex template for HTML, like full on with variables and assigns, but just for like code and files of truly any type. So it's kind of like the Swiss Army knife, right? So here's our first code snippet of the day. And remember, we're trying to generate our own config files for our project. So imagine at your company, your Acme company, you use Circle CI to run your tests on every push, right? Or insert whatever tool you want to plug into or need to configure it. So Circle CI needs a config file. It needs to live in a Circle CI directory in the root of your project. And it's probably going to be unique to your company, right? At least it probably needs your company's like Circle CI credentials, or you might want to make it so that it runs tests on every push just to the main branch, or on every branch, or something. The point is, it's unique to you, right? So if we insert this snippet into a custom mix task within our project, hopefully, like, you can kind of squint and see what it's doing. It's going to create a Circle CI directory, and then it's going to copy a Circle CI config YAML file into that directory. So let's take this for a spin. We can run mix new foo and create a new project, right? Nothing new here. And then we'll change into that project directory, and then we'll run our custom mix task. And here I've just called it acme.gen.boilerplate because I'm generating boilerplate. And you can see that, I kind of highlighted it there, it does indeed create a Circle CI directory right there in the project root, and it drops that config file right in there as well. And you can see just I outputted just like the first couple lines, so you can see, yes, it truly is an actual file here. This is super powerful. And you can extrapolate this out not just to this one config file, but all of your config files. And it doesn't have to be just copying file A into directory B. You can also use it to modify existing bits of your code. So you can kind of morph your new repository project into whatever manner you see fit. So we can package this up as an archive so that we can run mix-acme.new from anywhere. And again, here we go, everything works great. The only magic between the previous step and this one is that I just kind of wrapped that new mix command, shoved that boilerplate one inside of the other one, so that we are, remember, I'm in pursuit of just a one single command. I don't want to create a new project, then run the mix generator, and then be done. I just want to run mix-acme.new and be done with it. So now we have that functionality here. But now we have a new problem. How do I distribute this mix task, this new archive, to the rest of my coworkers, right? How are they going to be able to use it? So like I said, this is an archive, and everybody's going to need to run mixarchive.install. Again, going back to the Phoenix example, if you look on there, the Phoenix framework, documentation, the first thing it says to do is mixarchive.install Phoenix something or other. So we're going to have to do that too. But I can't just put this on Hex, right? This has all of my company's secrets in here. So I can't make this public. So where do I host this, right? What we need is a private package repository. So just like Hex, but only accessible to your company's engineers or just people within your company. And at this point, it's worth noting that Hex offers this as a service, as a paid service. This is probably the best option for most of you or most companies, especially smaller ones. In Spotify's situation, it's quite large, and considering that Elixir was kind of this experimental, unsanctioned project that was happening, it didn't really make sense for me to go through and fight the whole expense process to make that work. So not great for my situation, but if I was starting from scratch or doing this somewhere else, I'd highly suggest trying that out first. So looking around, I was trying to figure out, can I do this? Is this something that can be done? How do you host these things privately? I found an excellent blog post from Dockyard that pointed to a couple other projects, including Hex's own local registry and their instructions. But after playing around with a couple different options, I settled on this one called urepo. Urepo, another asterisk here, seems abandoned. I don't think there's been a commit in the last 3 years, so I'm not sure that I would recommend it today. But I am running it successfully, and it's working for me. As is the case with a lot of Elixir projects, it's small, it's easy to understand, and it just works. So I'm a big fan. And the key differentiator for me was that I love the fact that it not only acts as a package repository, but it also acts as a documentation hosting server for you as well, which is going to be very important later on, as you'll see in a second. Okay, so now we've got urepo up and running. There's nothing really to see there. We've just started the service. So now you can imagine in your mind's eye that this package repository is up and running internally somewhere. I'm glossing over quite a bit there, but that's essentially what you need to do. By default, it's going to store its packages locally on its own file system. So if you're running this in production, you're going to want to configure it and point that persistent backend at S3 or Google Cloud Storage, like one of those buckets, so that if your server crashes and or you need to like move it onto a new one, you don't lose all of your internal libraries. That would be terrible. But it's easy enough to just change a config out and point it at one of the cloud solutions. Right. So we've got the package repository. It's up and running. Let's start using it. How easy is it to start pushing archives and libraries to it? Well, like the answer is quite easy. And you do it the exact same way that you would publish a library to Hex. If any of you all have done that, it operates just the same as it would in the wild. So you only have to do one little thing first. You need to change your config up there in the top left. That snippet is from the mix.exs file. You need to add a hex key, and then within that little hex function, you need to define I think it's the API URL. So by default, that's configured to point to hex, but you don't want to publish your package to hex, right? You want to publish it to your own internal package repository, so change that URL out, add your secret to it if you have that configured, and then you should just be able to run mix hex.publish, just like if you were doing it out in the wild. So in the output there, as you can see, it's doing essentially two things. We've uploaded our package, that first red line, or red arrow, it shows that we've uploaded our package to urepo. And in the second red line, it's showing that we're also publishing our documentation to urepo as well. And that documentation, it's just like you would expect. ExDoc runs and auto-generates it, and then it gets pushed out to urepo. And there you go. Like it's just the same as anybody else's documentation that you've probably seen a million times if you've ever tried to look up docs for any library that you're trying to use. The only difference is where it's hosted. It's not on HexPM. It's now on your own internal urepo.acme.com or .net, whatever I decided to put up there, which is pretty cool. And for me, like what we've just done is kind of a game changer internally, right? You've got all your engineers now creating libraries instead of just like sharing code snippets back and forth with each other, or like pointing directly to like specific Git commits or hashes. And all of the, like critically, all of the documentation for all of these libraries is in one place on one website internally that your coworkers can just go to and browse and see everything that's available to them internally. Maybe, something that one of my coworkers did has solved the problem that I've been banging my head against a wall for the past few days. So that's really cool. And I can go in, click through, read all the docs, and get all the information that I need. And it is so important to note that we've now recreated kind of like almost the exact same developer experience that you would have if you were developing publicly. And this means that as a new engineer, both like a new engineer to Elixir or like a new engineer to your company, can, like, how do I learn? I mean, be honest, like I'll Google, hey, how do I like use a library? And whatever beginner tutorial blog post I find, like I'm going to be able to follow those same instructions internally, which is pretty cool. And it's going to kind of like help out, anybody joining your team. And we've talked about publishing your packages now, but if you're wondering what the experience looks like from the perspective of that engineer who is trying to use your library, and check out the docs, like it's actually pretty much the same as you would expect. In your mix.exs file, you specify the dependency just like you would normally. The only difference is that you would also pass in this repo Acme or repo, whatever you've decided to call your internal repo name, as an option to it as well. So this does exactly what it looks like. It just says, hey, Elixir, go fetch this dependency, but fetch it from this specific repo that you're specifying specifically here. And I just find this quite readable, and just generally like it does what it says it's going to do. Plus, you actually get to like kind of like keep the semantic versioning, so none of that changes, and you can automatically go and fetch newer updates like the same way that that works with the rest of your libraries. So at Spotify, once we got to this point, where it became really easy for engineers to write and share their libraries, and any new Elixir project was spun up with mix Spotify.new and already had all the boilerplate, and everybody's pulling in each other's dependencies, it kind of like created this, like snowball effect, and it kind of like led to this like mini explosion of new libraries internally, and that was really cool to see. And right about this time, this is maybe like a year or so and change ago, maybe, I don't know, somewhere around there. But right in the middle of this, once we got this working, that's right around the same time that livebook hit the scene. Next slide. There we go. Yeah. So as soon as I saw livebook, I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be excellent for interactive documentation. We've got all these libraries. What could be better than just like if I could put a badge at the top of each library, and whoever's looking at it can click that button, and it's going to spit you out into a running livebook instance. And not only can I read the documentation, but I can actually like play with the documentation and see how this library functions and how it works. And furthermore, because we have all the tools that we just talked about baked in, like I can bake that functionality into my boilerplate generator, right? So that every single Spotify project that gets spun up has a livemd file created with it and a badge in its README and in its docs that points to that livemd file. And that's pretty cool. So this worked, but it was just a little bit clunky in that like the default behavior, if you go and generate that badge from livebook.dev, it will create the badge for you, but the URL that it spits out, it's going to direct you to livebook.dev first. And then it prompts you like, hey, which livebook instance do you want me to open this in? It's like, do you want to spin it up on fly.io, which is awesome? Do you want to run it like locally? But I thought maybe we can do a little bit better too, because already, like, remember, we're already hosting like our package repository, we're hosting our own docs. Like, what if we just like host our own livebook instance too? And then we can cut out the middleman. So hopefully this plays through. Yeah, so now, like, I click on that badge, I go directly to livebook.acme.net, wherever you want to host your livebook instance. And as you can see, like, it goes directly in, opens it up, and like instantly, like, it's referencing your library right there and pulling it in as a dependency, and then you have access to everything in your library right in your livebook. The only thing that you had to change, like I said, you have to modify that URL that the badge is pointing to. It turns out that your livebook instance exposes a import endpoint, and then that takes like the path to your livemd file. So you wire that all together, and you've got it where you can hop directly into the livebook sandbox. And this is so cool. Just like it's such a great experience. Like as an engineer who's like, I wonder if this library works, or I wonder how this works, and you can just go in and play around with it, like no local setup needed. Like I don't even need Elixir installed on my own machine to like be doing this, which is awesome. So let's recap, because it's worth taking a step back and kind of like explaining everything that we just did. Like, to create a library, you run mix.spotify.new, and then to publish it, mix hex.publish, almost exactly like you would out in the wild. And then to use the library, you create your project with mix Spotify.new, And then maybe you browse to the docs page and you see all of the libraries that your coworkers have created, and they're uploaded to that urepo docs page. You can read all the docs. They're auto-generated by ExDoc. They're in the format that's predictable and familiar to you. You can click a button in each one to test it out and make sure it's exactly what you need. And then you can go through and add it to your project just like you would a normal dependency, just specifying the internal repo. So I wonder if this will play for us. Maybe, maybe not. I guess not. But that was a little video that shows exactly what we just did already. So before we wrap up, I just want to point out a couple useful links. It was a Dashbit blog post that explained kind of like how to run these private package repositories locally, and then the actual like Hex blog post that shows their solution, and then a link to the urepo GitHub page if you want to play around with that project. And then finally, I just wanted to end again, kind of like referencing adoption, because as a community, like I feel like we spend a lot of time talking about increasing Elixir adoption. Like your company, how can I convince my company to switch languages, or how can I be using this more in my day-to-day job? And that usually means talking to like convincing leadership, or navigating internal politics, or how do I build the case about like, and just show everybody like how awesome the beam is, or you know what its strengths are, and where it would be really good to be applied. And all of that is like, it's super necessary, and it's important work, and you absolutely need to do it. But I hope that this talk shows you that there are practical things that you can be doing and having an effect like today to create a better developer experience, like internally. Because then it becomes like a show, don't tell, right, type of thing. And if you can reduce the time it takes for a new engineer to slog through setup and the docs and get them from like not knowing or like banging their head against the wall, how do I stand this thing up, or how do I start an Elixir project, and get them as fast as possible to experimenting and having fun. Like you can be playing around in livebook in like with no effort. Then you'll start generating excitement and momentum, and that just sort of starts snowballing, and then adoption just comes a whole lot easier, right? It kind of like emerges from those properties, and that's kind of like what we saw a little bit. So that's my talk. Like I said, if you find any of this interesting, I work at theScore. We're absolutely hiring. And yeah, if you have any questions, if we have time, I'd be happy to take a few. Thank you.
Yeah, so a couple of questions have been asked already on Whova. Also, if people here in the room have a question, feel free to come to the front because we are using this single microphone, and then you can ask it over here. But to start with a question from Whova, Freddy Morales asks, instead of a hosted package repository, which is what you showed us just now, another approach might be to use Git dependency options and point directly to a tag or particular commit or branch of a Git repository. So why did you decide to go this particular route?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's what a lot of places just anecdotally seem to be doing as their solution for this. It works, it's great, I would say absolutely do it. I think there's a little bit of like a readability like thing where if you're just specifying like, hey, go get it from this repo, then it's a little bit clearer. It also helps kind of like how I mentioned with like the semantic versioning. I think you automatically get updates. Like if I bump the version and publish that, then like my dependency can just know to automatically get like the new minor version that's just come out. So all of that behaves the same. So maybe it's worth the little extra effort to kind of like set up your private packages Maybe not, but feel it out for yourself and at your own companies.
Hey, thanks a lot for the great talk. I have two questions. The first is there also kind of an overview where you can search through, like see all the packages in the repo and maybe also with full text search? And the second question is, do you see environments where there's not microservices, maybe a mono repo, maybe just a single Elixir app where this still makes sense? I'm mostly talking about the Hex repo. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So yes, out of the box, if you stand up, if you just git clone you repo and then you run it, the home page, if you spin it up and hit the home page, it's going to spit out just a very unstyled, like unordered list of links to each one of the packages that it has that's been published to it. I've long wanted to find like a couple hours to go through and like style it and add like a search bar into it, but for now, like there's still only like on the order of tens of libraries internally. So just Control F works close enough, or you can just kind of look at them all. But if you ended up with like hundreds, then yeah, plus like styling it to make it look a little prettier would be cool. I forgot the second part.
When you don't have microservices.
Oh, right. Would you still use this if you didn't have microservices? I think it takes like a little bit of a mind shift, right? Like if I'm developing in a mono repo or a monolith, and maybe like I'm pulling in things that are just different directories within that project, then maybe it's not so useful to you to like divide up into, to carve those out and separate them out into separate libraries. If you find yourself creating multiple repositories that have that same dependency, that's when it becomes useful to kind of like move them out into libraries that can be easily shared across projects, I think.
One more question from Huva, and then we will do a final question from the live audience. Akash Khan asks, did you encounter any issues setting up the infrastructure for hosting, like, for instance, requiring maybe a CDN for packages?
Not too much. Didn't have to do anything with the CDN. There were some quirks that I had to set up with like urepo to handle the versioning. Like there was a bug in it where like it was like if you looked on the ExDocs, and you know how you can like see all of the past versions, and that's something that it also does. It will keep every version historically, so you can like go back and look at the docs from like before. It was ordering them inversely, so it was thinking like the newest thing was always version 0.0.1. But yeah, getting it stood up. I think the one thing that I will say is if you're setting this up in production for yourselves, like consider whether that like you want to lock it down behind like a VPN or behind like some type of single sign-on or whatever your auth strategy is, to make sure that you're not exposing like these sites publicly or your package repository publicly. Just make sure that whatever your build server is that needs to like go and grab the dependencies has the ability to, is behind that firewall or on that same network. And that can be a little tricky. Yeah, depending on your setup.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was very insightful, especially the run with livebook button. I think I'm going to steal that for Fresha. Yeah, I just wanted to ask about Backstage, because as far as I remember, didn't Backstage use like cookie cutter for the project templates? How did that work with kind of creating this custom command? Because that's something that we've been considering, but we're using cookie cutter because of that that compatibility with Backstage. So could you expand on that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think by default, Backstage does use cookie cutter to create and copy over like new projects. And actually, whenever I joined Spotify, they had an Elixir cookie cutter button there. And the problem was that it immediately got out of date because somebody built it once and then never touched it again for a couple years. So like that, one-click wizard was like giving you a new Elixir project on like version Elixir 1.9, and we were on like 1.12 at the time. That was the newest and greatest and latest. So it becomes dicey. Like if you have to make sure that you're going and updating that underlying cookie cutter repo. Whereas if you're just pointing it to like running mix new, whatever, then you're automatically like spinning it up with whatever like the latest version of Elixir is on that system at the time. You're building on top of all of the new things that have been, all of that. So you're guaranteed to get the latest. So I would encourage kind of like using those tools. And also like it just mimics, that's what you do regularly. And that's kind of like the theme, right? Like as you don't go read a blog post about like, how do I start a new Elixir project? Oh, like first use cookie cutter. Like you're gonna find like, use the mix tool first. So that would be my answer. I don't actually know, I never went through the trouble of wiring up the mix command to Backstage. We didn't get around to that. Maybe my coworkers who still work there have done so. I would hope so. That'd be cool. But yeah, that would be really cool to do.
I have one more comment about the GitHub dependencies. Because there was the question about why not use GitHub repositories with tags, right, as dependencies instead of setting up a hex repo. So one use case that we found out where it breaks is that if you have a library that depends on another library of yours, you cannot have a hex library that depends on a GitHub repository, because then the version resolution, I think, breaks, and that's what it broke for us when we had one library that needed to depend on another library of ours. So we couldn't use GitHub then. We needed to use a private repo. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yep. Thank you.
Ryan, thank you very much for your presentation. Please give him another big round of applause.